Each week, we have an in-depth interview about the legislative process. This week, we welcome Jared Walczak. Mr. Walczak is the Vice President for State Affairs at the Tax Foundation, a Washington-based think tank that studies and advises on tax policy. He joins us today via Zoom. Jared, welcome to At Issue.
Well, thank you for having me.
First, tell us a little bit about yourself and about the work of the Tax Foundation.
Yeah, so I'm Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation. We are a think tank that does tax policy at the federal, state, local, and even global level. So what we're doing is focusing on tax policy education for lawmakers, for the general public, helping people understand the trade-offs associated with all of these complex tax policy decisions being made across the country.
So when a situation like this in Mississippi comes up, I guess, are you watching for situations like this all around the country, or watching for legislation regarding tax policy that might come up in any of our state legislatures?
We're monitoring tax policy across the country. There are, as you might imagine, thousands of bills on tax policy going in the states. Most of them aren't going anywhere, but when there are significant proposals like this one, we're paying attention. We're talking to lawmakers, and when there are potential issues or whether there's things to consider, we're trying to engage and help inform that debate.
Well, I have to ask, have you ever seen a situation like the one we find ourselves in here in Mississippi right now?
It's a significant one, but yes, actually, you would be surprised how often issues like this come up where there are significant typos in bills or conflicting provisions. Often it's caught before final passage, before enrollment of the bill, but not always. Governors fix bills in substantial ways through amendments every year. Bills get fixed in subsequent years. You'd like to not have that problem, but there are more than 100,000 bills that move in state legislatures every year, and you'd be surprised what happens when the process starts moving quickly.
What do you make of that situation here where a typo was identified in a bill and it was passed anyway, and then the governor signed it anyway?
Yeah, well, I think I was the first one to mention this publicly, probably not the first to see it. I think the discussions were already ongoing, but yeah, I mentioned this and, there was some focus on that. In some ways, it's not surprising to me that there was a desire to move forward. I think it's important that it still be fixed, and there's still an opportunity to do that through other legislation. There are some reasons to think that despite the clear error, there are other safeguards in the bill that will prevent some of the worst scenarios from happening, but it's not what lawmakers intended. Clearly, the trigger is not quite what they thought it was, and it makes sense to use other pending legislation to fix that if possible this year, or certainly before that starts to go into effect, that piece in 2031.
Let's talk about those triggers. What's your opinion of the triggers that the Senate intended to put in place, and how would they have worked in practice?
What's interesting is these are actually very conservative triggers as designed, in the sense that they're actually relatively hard to trigger with reductions. Most states, when they're looking at tax triggers, they're primarily looking at revenue growth. They're saying, are revenues growing fast enough for us to return a portion of that to the taxpayer? What Mississippi lawmakers wanted to do was to look at both the revenue growth and potential spending cuts, to say that if you were able to keep spending down to a significant degree, that could also trigger a cut. But the way they did this, any given year, you're looking at last year's actual appropriations, the actual spending, and the prior year's actual revenues. So you're requiring spending last year to be lower than revenues 2 years ago. If your economy's growing, if your revenues are growing, you could have room to cut taxes even with spending being slightly higher, because revenues are even higher than that. So this is stricter than most, in the sense that you really need those revenues to be substantially higher than the spending. Eventually it'll catch up. These triggers would trigger actual reductions even as designed, but it's slower. However, it's not as slow as they intended, and there's potentially some risks, because what they intended very conservatively was to make this reduction, you needed about 85% of the cost of a 1 percentage point rate reduction to reduce the rate by 0.25%. So it was actually it was a lot of additional revenue, or a lot of delta you needed to make this cut. But they accidentally made it 0.85% rather than 85%. And there's several other numbers as well, and they're all off by that 2 orders of magnitude, where it's 0.85 or 1.15 rather than 115, so on across the board.
So what if that typo is not adjusted and fixed, if the language in the bill and the governor's signed is not changed? What are the stakes?
Because the intended design was so conservative, it's not necessarily a crisis. It could still work because you still need revenues 2 years ago to be higher than spending last year by a trivial amount rather than a significant amount, like by next to nothing, but they still have to be higher revenues 2 years ago than spending last year. And that's actually hard to do. And if you're doing that, especially in a growing economy, you probably have room to make these reductions. The concern we raised is what if you're in a recession and 2 years ago you had high revenues and 1 year ago you made a lot of spending cuts because you knew this recession was coming or it had already happened. Now your expenditures are down, your revenues previously are higher, you could trigger a cut. What you'll hear from lawmakers, and I think it's a very fair point, is there's also a requirement that the rainy day fund be fully fucked. So the argument is if we're in a recession, we're probably drawing that down. We're not making our new deposit, and therefore we're okay. There's maybe still a timing issue. You could imagine some scenarios where this doesn't work and where lawmakers would then have to go pause it themselves. And that's not a good situation. You'd rather mechanistically this prevent a cut. But I want to say that like most years, this probably would work despite the mistake. That doesn't mean it's not worth fixing the mistake.
Mississippi receives about $2.60 from the federal government for every dollar that Mississippi sends to Washington. And with all the uncertainty about federal cuts, whether those will happen, how deep they might be, is this even a time for a state like Mississippi to risk cutting existing revenue?
So federal spending into states comes in a couple of different buckets. Much of it goes directly to individuals, things like Social Security and Medicare, which the state never touches. But then there's Medicaid, and there's other programs where the state covers a significant share of that. There's a revenue sharing element of that or a cost sharing element of that. And yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty right now about whether some of that will be reduced. And if that aid to states is reduced, then every state, certainly Mississippi, will have to make some hard choices about revenues, about spending. Every state's going to be in this situation. If significant cuts happen at the federal level, you're going to see special sessions across the country. What I'll say is that almost no one is really preparing as if this is going to happen because it's hard to do. I mean, no one is underspending by billions of dollars this year. No one's raising taxes by billions because this could happen. They're holding steady. They're doing whatever they would have been doing otherwise, and then saying, we may have to come back in the summer, in the fall, and address this. So what Mississippi is doing is not unusual. If the state felt that it could do, tax cuts previously, then like every state, it's just going forward with what it felt it could do. And of course, there are triggers for the out years. But whatever a state does, whatever its tax rates, whatever its spending, if there are substantial federal changes, people are coming back to the table and there will be changes.
If that decimal point is fixed and the language is adjusted, do you think it would be sound fiscal policy for Mississippi the way the bill's written?
All the discussions on the triggers starting in fiscal year 2031, and those are pretty conservative triggers. If they can hit those the way they're designed, I think Mississippi's probably in good shape to cut. The first 3 years are actually just rate reductions, getting down to 3%. And it does appear right now that Mississippi can afford to do that, but that's real. And that is not based on revenues coming in at certain rates. Those are just reductions. And, we know that tax rates make a difference for people. We know that states have greater economic growth when there's lower taxes, particularly lower income taxes. We also know that individuals and businesses care about the services that are provided in a state. They care about a lot of different things. Lawmakers are going to have to hold these in balance with each other. No income tax is a great goal, but it's not the ultimate goal. You just want a prosperous economy, and Mississippi needs to make sure that it can provide those services. Lawmakers are going to have to keep monitoring that as this happens.
We've all heard about the Kansas example, especially lately during this legislative session. If Kansas did it wrong, how have other states done it right?
Yeah, Kansas is a story everyone hears, and in some ways that's really good. You want to hear the horror story to learn what you shouldn't do. But there's another story, and that's that since 2021, 28 states have cut their individual income tax rates. And you haven't heard Kansas-style stories about them because they've generally done it well. And really, since the 2013 tax cuts in Kansas, a lot of states, almost every state really, has done something on income taxes and hasn't had that experience. In Kansas, what happened? You had a governor who really wanted significant tax cuts. You had a basically no economic growth environment. So he wanted a $1.1 billion tax cut. The legislature was going to pair that with $1 billion of spending reductions. That's hard to do. In Kansas, they couldn't come up with $1 billion. So they split the difference by basically saying no spending cuts, $1.1 billion tax cut, and we'll just hope we grow into it. That did not work. That's not surprising it didn't work. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves. They create some new economic growth. They don't pay for themselves like that. So Kansas found itself in a hole. And I think most states learned from that, and they've been way more responsible since then. We've seen pro-growth, responsible, measured tax relief. And it's important that Mississippi do the same thing. I think that the Senate in particular was focused on making sure that the cuts weren't too fast, too steep. That was a concern that we had, especially with some of the earlier proposals, but still going to have to be monitored to make sure that the state is putting this relief in commensurate with its ability to afford it.
Jared Walczak, Vice President for State Affairs at the Tax Foundation. We thank you for sharing your perspective with At Issue.
Thank you.